In the Black Forest of southern Germany, the ground is damp with leaf litter, exposed roots and small stones, and the first water of the Danube is easy to miss. It begins in a wooded setting that does not look large enough to produce one of Europe's great rivers. Yet this is the Danube, a river that will continue for about 2,850 kilometers, or roughly 1,770 miles, before it reaches the Black Sea. That contrast is the reason to follow it slowly. At the start, there is no broad horizon and no immense current, only a modest beginning among trees, paths, and rising ground in the upper landscape of southwestern Germany. From there, the river gathers direction and distance. It crosses or touches 10 countries as it moves eastward through the continent, changing shape again and again before ending in a wide delta of reeds, channels, and open water far from this quiet forest edge. Over the course of that long route, the banks will not remain the same for very long. Forested upper reaches give way to farmland and open plains. Small settlements appear, then larger towns, then capitals with bridges, embankments, and traffic moving above the water. The river passes places shaped by trade, war, engineering, and routine daily work. Barges move where once other vessels moved. Church towers, apartment blocks, factories, fortresses, and river ports come into view in different stretches, each one close to the water for practical reasons before any larger meaning is attached to them. But the full scale of the Danube is easiest to understand when its end is set beside its beginning. Here, near the source region, the water seems contained by slope, soil, and forest cover. At the far end of the journey, the river spreads into one of Europe's great wetland landscapes before meeting the sea. Birds move above marshland. Reeds thicken along shallow channels. The current that began in a small wooded setting arrives there after passing through a long chain of human and natural environments, carrying silt, traffic, runoff, stories, and the ordinary marks of use from one region to the next. This documentary will follow that progression at a steady pace, from the upper course toward the mouth, watching the river change as the land around it changes. The movement will be gradual. We will stay close to the banks and notice the practical details that define each stretch. The narrowing and widening of the channel, the shift from hills to plains, the look of quays and bridges, the presence of fields, stone embankments, ferries, floodwalls, marshes, and quiet sidewaters. History will appear where it is visible in the built landscape and in the patterns of settlement. Wildlife will appear where the river still leaves room for it. Daily life will remain part of the view throughout, because the Danube is not only long, but continuously used. For now, though, it is enough to stay with the fact that such a river starts so modestly. That is the central shape of the journey ahead. The Danube does not announce its scale at once. It begins near wet ground, under trees, in a region of paths, villages, and upper streams, and only later becomes the broad international waterway so often shown on maps. To follow it well, it makes sense to begin where its scale is still hidden. So before the capitals, before the long plains, and before the reed beds at the edge of the Black Sea, we return to the upper Danube and to the small forested landscape where the course first takes form. The water is still close to the ground here, still near roots and stones, still in the setting where a continental river can be overlooked at a glance. That is where the journey begins, and that is where we will begin too. In the upper Black Forest, near Furtwangen am Schwarzwald in Baden-Württemberg, the land rises into cool upland ground where meadow and forest meet in a quiet, enclosed landscape. Here, near the Martinskapelle area, the Bregspring offers the most useful hydrological beginning for following the Danube back to its first visible water. The river does not yet bear that name at this point. That comes farther on, when the Breg meets the Brigash near Donaueschingen. But on this high ground, in wet soil beneath short grass and close woodland, The course that will lead toward the Danube can be approached in its smallest and clearest form. The setting is modest. There is no wide valley yet, no strong current, and no broad water surface to hold the eye. The air is cool more often than warm, and the ground keeps moisture easily. Grass lies low over damp earth. Moss holds along the edges where the soil stays dark and soft. Beyond the open patchwork of meadow, the woodland stands close, with conifers and mixed trees forming a dense margin that limits the view and keeps the place feeling sheltered. Even in still weather, there is a sense of elevation here, a slight remoteness, as though the land has lifted away from the larger roads and settlements below. At the spring itself, the beginning is easy to underestimate. The first water does not resemble a famous European river. It appears as a cold emergence through wet ground, slight and narrow, more a clear run than a stream in the larger sense. It passes through grass, touches moss, and moves over dark soil with very little display. In places it seems hardly separate from the saturated earth around it. Only after a closer look does the eye begin to follow a line. The water is present, continuous, and moving, but in a form so small that the later Danube feels almost impossible to place beside it. That small scale matters. The source is not merely a point on a map, but a physical condition of land and water. The earth here is soaked rather than dry, and from that wet ground, the headwater begins to collect into a clearer thread. The channel is shallow. Its edges are irregular, sometimes no more than a slight cut through grass and mud. A boot placed carelessly nearby would seem large beside it. Yet the motion is real. The water keeps to a direction, slight though it is, and once that direction becomes visible, the first true course can be understood. What begins here is not grandeur, but continuity. Seen closely, the spring area has very little excess. There are no rocky cliffs, no steep banks, no dramatic fall of water. The interest lies lower than that, almost at ground level, in the contact between clear cold flow and the soft upland surface that receives it. The water darkens the soil where it passes. It leaves a narrow gloss between blades of grass. In the wetter spots, the earth gives slightly underfoot, and the border between land and stream remains uncertain. This is one reason the place feels so exact. The beginning is visible, yet still closely bound to the ground from which it comes. Around this narrow run, the upper black forest remains close and restrained. Meadow plants hold low to the ground. Moss softens the wetter patches. The forest edge is never far away, and with it come darker shade, fallen needles, and the cooler smell of damp wood and soil. Light changes quickly in upland weather. A bright interval can pass over the grass, then give way again to a flatter, dimmer sky. Nothing needs to be dramatic for the place to feel distinct. Its character lies in the combination of height, moisture, enclosure, and the plain fact of cold water beginning to move downhill. Animal life stays quiet in such a setting. A small bird may shift briefly along the meadow edge or sound from the trees without being seen for long. Insects move low in the grass when the air is mild enough. Now and then there is only the faint disturbance of stems bending or a slight flicker close to the ground, gone before the eye settles on it. These signs do not take over the scene. They remain part of the background conditions of a living upland source, where water, soil, and plant cover matter more than display. To remain with this beginning for a while is to see how little is required for a major river to start. Not breadth, not force, only persistent water, finding a narrow path through high, wet land. The Break Spring near Furtwangen offers that beginning with unusual clarity. The later name of Danube belongs downstream, after confluence and growth, but the physical origin traced here is already enough to set the journey in motion. From this cold thread in meadow ground, the water will soon leave the spring area more decisively, take a more readable channel, and begin the first small passage away from the high forest. Near Donaueschingen, where the Brigach and Breg come together, the Danube can first be followed as one continuous river moving away through the land. The water is still small, but it now has a single course, a visible direction, and a channel that can be read from bank to bank. This early stretch is not a spring or a disputed point of origin. It is the first practical reach of the young Danube as a narrow upper-course river, already formed enough to leave its confluence behind and begin its own passage onward. At first, the scale remains restrained. The river is cool, fairly shallow, and close to the shape of the ground beneath it. Its bed is narrow and in places rocky, with stones and gravel showing clearly through the water. The current responds at once to slight slope, tightening where the bed dips, loosening where the channel opens by even a small amount. Low banks hold it in place. Exposed soil, short grass, and damp margins stay close to the flow, so that the surroundings still seem to press directly on the water rather than stand apart from it. This is the point at which the Danube begins to look less like a wet source area and more like a working river channel. The water moves around small stones instead of merely issuing from the ground. It takes slight bends where the margins turn. In narrower sections, it runs a little faster, making a clean surface over the shallows, then slows again where the bed broadens, or a patch of gravel interrupts the line of flow. In calmer pockets, the surface steadies, while a few steps farther on it may wrinkle again over a stony rise. These changes are modest, but they matter. Width and depth already vary from one short stretch to the next, and the young river starts to show the first signs of wear along its edges. Those edges are still low enough to be easily read. A little grass hangs over the bank in places. Elsewhere, the margin is bare and dark with moisture or broken by loose stones that have settled near the waterline. Small indentations suggest where the current has pressed longer against one side than the other. On the inside of a slight bend, fine sediment may rest more quietly. On the outside, the water keeps a firmer line. Nothing here is large or dramatic, yet the channel is no longer uncertain. It has begun to shape itself by movement, however slight, and the ground has begun to answer. As the river leaves the confluence area and continues through its first kilometers, small additions of water join without changing the overall scale. A narrow side flow may slip in from damp ground. A modest runnel may enter from a grassy edge after rain, or from a shallow hollow in the nearby land. These are quiet additions, easy to miss unless the eye stays low and patient, but they make the flow feel steadier and more complete. The Danube remains a young river, not yet broad, not yet deep, but less isolated now than at its beginning and more continuous with each small input. Even where no joining stream is visible, wetter margins and darkened soil suggest how closely the surrounding ground still feeds the channel. The land beside it stays close and functional. There is damp earth under the grass, exposed patches of soil where the bank is worn, and low vegetation that follows the line of moisture. Stones lie not far from the water, and in some reaches the bed still feels only lightly covered, as though the structure of the channel can be seen almost all at once. The sense of enclosure from the source region has eased, but the river is still intimate in scale. It can be followed without effort by watching how it turns, narrows, widens, and responds to each slight change in ground. Life around this early course remains restrained. A small bird may appear briefly at the bank, then lift away before disturbing the stillness of the scene. Insects move over the surface where the water slows enough to hold them for a moment. Near the edges, stems shift faintly in the air or in the passing movement of the current below. These details remain secondary. The true focus stays on the young channel itself, on clear water moving over gravel, on shallow depth, on low margins beginning to show use and pressure. What matters here is that the Danube now has a course that can be followed. It has left the exact question of source behind and entered a more definite form, narrow but committed, shaped by bed, bank and slope. As it moves onward from Donaueschingen, the changes are still small enough to observe closely, almost step by step. Yet from this point the river is no longer only beginning, it is proceeding, and its first upper reach is now firmly underway, ready to carry the journey farther into the land. At Donaueschingen, the beginning of the Danube is not only a matter of water rising in a round stone basin, it is also a place where people tried to explain what they saw, and to give a clear form to a beginning that was never entirely simple. The early Danube could be understood through naming, through local sayings, through the wider respect once given to springs, and through later images that turned a river into a figure that could be recognized and followed. One of the clearest inherited formulas from the source region is the old saying, Brigach und Breg bringen die Donau zuweg. In plain terms, the Brigach and the Breg bring the Danube on its way. The words are simple, but they answer a real uncertainty. In this landscape, the river does not begin in a single dramatic burst. It depends on converging waters, on local geography, and on how a community chooses to identify a source. The saying gave people a memorable way to settle that question in everyday speech. It did not solve every hydrological dispute, but it offered a stable local understanding. The Danube begins when these upper waters are brought together and set in motion. The basin at Donaueschingen, with its steady cast spring, belongs to that same effort to make a beginning visible. Clear water rises there, beside church and residence, enclosed, named, and easy to point to. Stone edging gives the place a defined shape. The pool sits within an ordered setting rather than in open marsh or forest ground, and that alone changes how a source is perceived. What emerges from below can be approached, observed, and discussed. Even so, caution is necessary. The exact Donauquelle does not appear to have left behind a deep and well-attested cycle of source-specific legends. Later descriptions sometimes gave the place more legend than the record can safely support. It is better to say that the site likely invited explanation and reverence than to pretend it preserved an ancient treasury of local myth. A broader regional pattern helps explain why such a place could carry symbolic weight. In parts of Baden-Württemberg, springs were long treated with a special respect. They were associated with purity, clarity, and in older folk belief sometimes with healing. That does not mean this basin functioned as a major healing shrine, and there is little reason to force such a claim. But a clear spring emerging reliably from the ground would have been more than a practical water source. In a culture that often regarded springs as set apart from ordinary ground, the Donauquelle would naturally have seemed worthy of attention, care, and a certain quiet seriousness. The water is cool, contained, and visibly clean. Its steadiness would have encouraged trust as much as wonder. That seriousness may also help explain why the beginning of the river attracted personification. In Roman usage, the Danube was known as Danuvius, and in the Roman world, great rivers could be imagined as divine beings and honoured in that form. Here again, restraint matters. This does not prove that a documented Roman cult stood at this exact basin in Donaueschingen. The safer point is broader and more human. Once a river becomes large in the life of a region, people often stop treating it as water alone. They give it a face, a voice, a gender, or a story, because a river that connects so much land begins to feel like more than a channel. At Donaueschingen, that habit can be seen plainly in later visual form. The source sculpture from 1895 shows Mother Bar directing her daughter, the young Danube, toward the long course ahead. The image is gentle and legible. It does not ask the viewer to believe in a supernatural event. Instead, it gives shape to a local idea that this small beginning can be guided, named, and understood as the start of something much larger. The sculpture stands near the real spring, so allegory remains anchored to place. Stone figures offer an interpretation, but the basin beside them continues to do the quieter work of simply releasing water. That may be the most reliable way to understand this beginning. People explained it through proverb, through the older respect attached to springs, and through images that made the river easier to grasp. Each of those responses tells something true about human habits of thought. Yet none of them replaces the evidence of the site itself. The round pool, the pale stone rim, and the upwelling water remain the firmest authority here. They do not argue about origins. They do not settle every claim. They only continue, calmly and without emphasis, into the young current that soon leaves this enclosed setting and begins to move outward through the land. After the confluence near Donaueschingen, the young Danube begins to move northeast through ground that is already shaping its behaviour. Its bed is narrow, and in places distinctly rocky, with water slipping over stone rather than spreading widely across a broad floor. The nearby land does not feel uniform. Low slopes rise and fall beside the channel. The valley remains shallow but clearly guided, and the wider bar lies as a relatively narrow belt between the Black Forest and the Swabian Alb. Even at this early stage, the river is moving through a transition zone, and the form of the land can be read in the way the water is confined, released, and turned. Seen from the bank, that setting is made of small but telling contrasts. Some edges are firm and stony, where the ground holds its line and the channel feels slightly tightened. Other stretches soften into flatter margins where finer sediment can settle. The slopes are not high, but they are enough to direct runoff toward the valley floor, carrying loose material down after rain and during wetter seasons. In shallow sections, stone can show through the moving water, while on gentler inner bends there may be bars of gravel or patches of lighter sediment left in quieter pockets. Fields and open ground sit above these forms, while the river below works through a narrower course than its later size would suggest. The effect is of a young stream already finding a prepared path, not across one plain surface, but through ground with different textures and different resistance. That difference begins far below the grass, soil, and gravel now visible at the surface. To one side, the Black Forest contributes a much older highland built largely of hard crystalline rock, especially gneiss and granite. Those rocks belong to a far older foundation, compact and resistant. Farther along the upper Danube region, much of the landscape is shaped instead by Jurassic limestones and marls, laid down when ancient seas covered this part of Europe. In the bar, these rocks help create a step-like landscape. Ground rises, eases, and falls again in broad stages rather than in one single form. This does not produce a dramatic wall at every turn. More often it appears as a steady change in relief, a shift in slope angle, or a difference in how sharply the valley sides are marked. That is why the young Danube can seem, within a short distance, to pass from tighter and rougher stretches into gentler sections where the valley floor opens a little. As the river continues toward the Swabian Alb, limestone becomes more important. There, the thick white Jurassic beds helped create one of Germany's major karst regions. In such country, water does not always remain on the surface. It works into fissures, enlarges cracks, and over long periods helps form caves, sinkholes, and dry valleys where a stream once ran openly or might be expected to run. This is not yet the full story of the Danube's disappearing waters farther on, but the ground is already preparing for it. Limestone can be strong as a cliff or ledge, yet it can also be slowly dissolved. That combination gives the upper course some of its mixed character, rocky in one place, open in another, and always dependent on what lies under the thin cover of soil. The smaller materials along the banks tell the same story in quieter form. Where the current runs a little faster, coarser gravel and broken stone are more likely to remain. They are heavy enough to resist easy removal, so the bed feels rougher under shallow water. Where the valley bottom broadens and the flow loses energy during floods, finer material settles out. Silt, sand, and slope-washed sediment gather on flatter ground, building softer margins and a more even surface. After higher water, these deposits can be left as thin, fresh spreads across low ground, while the channel itself may show a newly trimmed bank or a small cut where older layers are exposed. None of this is separate from the river itself. The young Danube trims weaker banks, nudges loose stones forward, reveals pale layers in a cut edge, and then lays some of that burden down again when the current slackens. So even while it is still modest in size, the upper Danube is already part of a much older landscape of stone and dissolved rock, of lifted ground and worn ground, of gravel carried onward and finer sediment left behind. The narrow bed near Donaueschingen, the steppe-like country of the Bar, and the limestone regions farther ahead all help explain why this young river looks and moves as it does. It is following slopes prepared over immense spans of time, yet it is also altering them in small, continuous ways. The water remains clear in scale and local in sound, but the terrain guiding it has been forming for ages, and the river now goes on through that prepared ground toward the next change in its upper course. In the source region around Donaueschingen and across the Bar, the young Danube changes with the year because it runs through a cool, wet upland climate. Winters bring regular frost and snow. The warmer months are milder rather than harsh, yet rain returns often enough to alter the channel again and again. This is not a place of sharp extremes so much as recurring moisture, cold ground, thaw, and intervals of drying. That matters because this early river is still small in scale. A modest rise or fall in flow can change its colour, its speed, the firmness of its banks, and the way the nearby ground can be used. After prolonged rain, or when thaw begins to release water from the surrounding land, the young Danube becomes fuller and quicker. The current presses harder at the margins, and fewer stones remain visible above the surface. Water that was clear in a drier spell often turns duller, carrying disturbed sediment, so that the channel looks less transparent and more burdened. Grass at the edge lies dark and wet. Low places soften underfoot, and the line between river and meadow becomes less exact. In this upper valley, the change is usually modest, but it is enough to make the river harder to approach closely and to give it a broader, heavier look. When drier weather settles in, the same stretch can appear markedly reduced. The visible channel narrows, stones and gravel reappear in shallow places, and the current threads more clearly between them. The water often regains a cleaner look, not because it carries nothing, but because less runoff is entering from the ground around it. Bank lines become easier to read, firmer patches return beside the river, and low paths that had been soft or muddy begin to dry. On calmer days, the flow keeps more closely to one defined course, leaving a little more of its stony edge exposed. Warm periods do not usually empty the upper river, but they can make its margins look tidier, clearer, and easier to cross on foot there. Cold weather alters the river in quieter ways. Frost hardens the top layer of soil in the morning, even where the land beneath remains damp. Thin ice may form along the stillest edges, especially in sheltered places where roots or grass slow the water near the bank. The main current keeps moving, but the margins can show a pale fixed line that was not there the day before. In still air, morning mist sometimes gathers low over the channel, softening the opposite bank without hiding the shape of the river itself. These winter details do not stop the flow. They change its surface and its access, making the edge less certain and the ground more slippery. The practical turning points often come with thaw. In midwinter, or at the edge of spring, frozen ground releases, snow feeds the channels again. An extra runoff reaches the young Danube through wet fields, ditches, and saturated soil. Water that seemed contained a few days earlier begins to press over the lowest margins. Mud gathers where boots or wheels have broken the surface. Small cuts appear in softer banks, and fine sediment may be left in a thin coat on low ground after the water recedes. Nearby land answers each wet period in visible ways. Damp meadows stay greener where moisture lingers. Flatter patches receive fresh deposits. Low vegetation thickens where the soil stays wet longest. In drier intervals, those same places begin to firm again. Mud contracts, grasses lift back upright, and a margin blurred by water regains a clearer outline. Human responses remain modest and practical. A path used easily in one period may be avoided in another when the bank softens or the grass gives way underfoot. Work in nearby fields is adjusted to whether the margins are firm enough to cross, or still too wet to trust. In small settlements, familiarity with the river includes noticing when it has edged into low ground, when the approach is muddy, and when the clearer, narrower channel of a drier spell has returned. There is no need for alarm in these adjustments. They belong to ordinary knowledge beside a river that does not keep one exact shape. So the young Danube near its source is never simply one fixed ribbon of water. Through the year, it becomes fuller, duller, clearer, narrower, softer at the edges, or briefly held by frost, depending on rain, thaw, and dry intervals. The cycle returns each year, but not as a perfect pattern. One winter holds snow longer, another yields earlier. One warm period dries the margins more completely, another is interrupted by fresh rain. The river answers each combination in its own measure, and the bank, the path, the meadow, and the channel are all quietly revised as the seasons move on. At Donaueschingen, where the Brigach and the Breg come together, the Danube enters a different kind of country. It is no longer moving only through stone, slope, and seasonal ground. Very soon it begins to pass through settled space. At the edge of the town, the shift is already clear, but the pattern becomes easier to read in the first smaller places downstream, where the young river and human dwelling lie in close practical relation. Here the Danube starts to show why people remained near it, not because the bank was always easy, and not because the low ground was dry, but because water, workable soil, and a usable corridor through the land made settlement possible. Pforen is the first locality downstream from Donaueschingen, clearly tied to the young Danube's course. Neudingen lies on the young river as the southernmost district of the town, and farther on, Gutmedingen appears at the foot of the slope on the right side of the Danube. These are not random points scattered beside a stream. Their placement follows the shape of the valley. Regional historical geography describes Pforen as a compact clustered village in a bay of the Danube Valley. Neudingen is described as a clustered village in the Danube lowland on the right side of the river. Gutmedingen, too, stands in relation to slope and lowland rather than on some exposed or isolated site. The pattern is consistent. Buildings and lanes stay close enough to the river corridor to benefit from it, yet not so low that they surrender themselves to the wettest margins. That caution makes sense in this part of the upper valley. Between Donaueschingen and Pforen, parts of the Danube lowland were wet or marshy, and the river's seasonal shifts could soften ground, blur edges, and make the lowest places unreliable. Settlement did not ignore that condition. It adjusted to it. Houses gathered where the ground was firmer, slightly raised, or better drained, while the lowland itself remained useful in other ways. A village could stand in a valley bay at the foot of a slope or on the safer side of the river plain, while still keeping access to water, meadow, and root. That balance is more important than the idea of a settlement simply sitting on a bank. These early villages belong to the river because they are placed with it carefully, not because they crowd its edge. From that geography, everyday routine can be inferred without forcing the picture into a busy scene. Repeated paths would have led down toward accessible parts of the bank, especially where the slope eased and the footing held. Water for household use could be carried from reliable approach points, rather than taken from any random stretch. Animals might be brought to drink where the margin was open and manageable, not where mud or cut banks made the approach awkward. Small cultivated plots would make sense on workable ground nearby, supported by the fertile soils of the Bar, including the Lues that has long helped make this region useful for farming. None of these actions needs to be imagined as exceptional. They belong to ordinary settlement logic beside a modest river. Go where the ground allows, use what the river offers, and avoid the wettest or least stable edges. The deeper history of the Bar supports that pattern. Archaeological work shows repeated settlement close to the Danube in this region, suggesting that people returned to river-adjacent ground over long periods because it continued to be practical. The attraction was not only fresh water. The valley corridor also offered orientation and easier movement through the surrounding land. Nearby soils could be cultivated. Low meadows could be used when conditions allowed. The river helped define where firmer ground met wetter ground, where access was easiest, and where a settlement could maintain contact with both field and water. Even a small river can organize space in this way. It gives a line to follow, a margin to work with, and a reason for paths, plots, and clustered dwellings to hold together. So by the time the young Danube reaches these first villages, it is already more than a visible channel passing between banks. At Foren, Neudingen, and Gutmerdingen, the river begins to move through settled human existence. It offers fresh water, a guide through the valley, and steady support for field and household routine, even where parts of the lowland remain damp or uncertain. The houses do not simply decorate the river. They are there because this corridor could be lived in. From here onward, the Danube is no longer passing, only through landforms and weather. It is moving among place dwellings, used paths, worked ground, and the ordinary decisions by which people stayed near water without giving themselves over to it completely. Here, in the young Upper Danube, the river is already passing through an older human landscape, before later towns fixed names and boundaries more firmly onto the map. People had long been using the bar and the upper corridor of the river. The reason was close at hand. Beside this early Danube lay workable ground, open lowlands, and soils capable of supporting repeated settlement. This was not an accidental margin. It was one of the places in which human use could return, settle, and continue. The clearest early layer is the Neolithic. Archaeological and archaeopedological work in the bar points to continuous land use across that long period, and the pattern suits the land itself. Fertile Loess soils made this region one of the more favourable settlement zones between the Black Forest and the Swabian Jura. On such ground, farming could take hold more reliably than in harsher uplands nearby. The river mattered within that setting, but not alone. What made this stretch attractive was the combination. Water close by, broad usable land, and gently accessible country that could be worked over generations. Seen from the valley floor, the logic is still easy to follow. The young Danube runs through low ground that opens movement rather than obstructing it. Beside the banks there are usable margins, and above them slightly raised ground fit for occupation. Short terraces, firm edges, and cultivated patches would have offered practical positions from which to live close to water without settling in the wettest ground. Roots could follow the line of the valley, instead of forcing their way across rougher surrounding terrain. In later prehistory, this mattered as much as water or soil. A river corridor like this one offered passage, contact, and communication. It gave people a line through the region that could be walked, settled beside, and returned to again. That long attraction becomes more visible in the early medieval landscape. Neudingen offers one of the strongest examples along this upper reach. Merovingian grave goods found there point to an established importance, and the place later appears as an early medieval centre. It is described as a county seat and is understood as a likely administrative centre of extensive royal property in the Bar. The setting helps explain why. This was not high, defensive isolation, but a place connected to usable land and to the line of the river corridor itself. Excavations at Mariahof, near Neudingen, identified the simple chapel and fortifications of the royal court. Even these remains suggest a practical kind of power, fixed into the ground rather than displayed from a distance. Royal presence here was tied to control of land, passage, and the settled resources of the region. The record becomes especially concrete when Charles III, after his deposition, stayed there in the year 887. The detail is brief, but it places a known ruler within the same upper Danube landscape that had already drawn communities for centuries. Foren provides a smaller but useful sign of continuity. A grave with goods points to a Frankish period origin for the settlement. That single example does not need heavy explanation. It matters because it shows the same pattern in another place nearby. Occupation close to the river corridor, routes extending back before later documentation becomes fuller, and settlement growing from land that was already favourable for living and movement. The upper Danube was not lined with history all at once. It accumulated it gradually, where the ground allowed people to remain. Over time, more organised forms of control entered the picture, including royal estates and monastic influence, but the underlying geography did not change. Fields still depended on good soil. Occupation still favoured ground just above the wetter margins. Travel still followed the easier line through the valley. The names became more stable, the institutions more visible, yet the basic attraction of the corridor remained much the same as it had been in far earlier periods. The river did not create every settlement by itself, but it helped make this sequence of return and reuse possible. So, along these banks, where the Danube is still young, the landscape already shows the marks of many generations. People crossed this low country, farmed its better ground, buried their dead near the settlements they had built, and organised wider authority from places set close to the corridor. The water continued beside them, not as a backdrop, but as part of the reason this stretch of land was occupied again and again. And as the river moves onward through the bar, it leaves behind not an empty beginning, but a settled passage shaped early by soil, root, and repeated human use. Here the young Danube begins to matter not only as water beside fields and settlements, but as a route through the land. Even in its upper course, where the river is still narrow and often confined within a rocky bed, it offers a line that people can follow. This is not yet the broad navigable Danube known much farther downstream, and the modern navigable reach begins beyond this source region at Kelheim. But in the bar, the river and its valley already reduce distance, giving movement a direction and drawing paths, crossings, and short journeys into the same corridor. The practical logic of that route is visible in the ground itself. Away from the river, movement can be broken by rougher country, wetter patches, or rising land toward the surrounding uplands. Along the Danube Valley, the line is easier to read. There is low ground near the water, firmer edges above it, and banks and terraces that allow people to travel beside the river without losing its course. Archaeological work around the Fürstenberg indicates that proximity to the Danube made this area favourable from very early on, and that the Danube Valley probably already served as an important route for communication and trade. The river did not need to carry heavy traffic to organise movement. Its value began with simply showing the way. On the water itself, movement would have been modest, selective, and practical. This upper Danube was not a shipping river for large craft. Its narrow channel, rocky bed, and changing conditions limited what could move safely along it. Yet small boats, logboats, and simple rafts could still use downstream stretches where the current and depth allowed. Travel of that kind depended on local knowledge, where the bank could be approached, where the current pressed too hard against stone, where a load could be eased into the water, and where it had to be taken out again. In such a landscape, a natural bank of gravel, firm mud, or gently shelving ground mattered more than any elaborate harbour. Research on inland navigation between the Rhine and Danube shows that very simple landing places were often enough. A usable edge of bank, with minimal preparation, could serve for loading, unloading, or a short stop along the water. Ferry harbours often doubled as ordinary landing points, which suits this upper stretch well. What belongs here is not the image of a busy port, but of repeated use. A boat brought in where the bank opened slightly, a raft steadied in shallow water, goods shifted by hand from water to land, and then the journey continued by foot, animal, or cart. The exchange itself can remain small in scale and still be real. From the fertile bar, there could be farm produce moving out from settled ground close to the valley. Timber, including rafted wood, also fits the logic of downstream movement. Fish belong to the river economy at hand, while travellers use the same corridor for more than cargo. Archaeological work that identifies the Danube Valley as a route for communication also notes imported objects in the Fürstenberg and Danube Valley. Small signs that this was not a closed landscape, a few outside materials or finished objects reaching this upper corridor, are enough to suggest contact without turning the river into a major commercial road. Movement beside and across the Danube was just as important as movement on it. Bank paths would have linked nearby places along the valley floor. Shallow passages and ferry points would have reduced the barrier of the channel itself. At such crossings, travel could change form simply. A person might arrive on foot, an animal with a load might wait above the bank, a cart might stand back on firmer ground, and a small boat might serve only the short distance from one side to the other. Settlements in the Danube lowland help make that pattern concrete. Nudingen, for example, belonged to a setting in which the river organised approach as much as transport. Paths descended toward the bank, crossings tied one side of the lowland to the other, and nearby communities were drawn into a shared corridor of movement. In that sense, the young Danube was already carrying links between places before it could be described as a great waterway. So this upper river begins to change character, though only slightly and in believable ways. It remains a young Danube, narrow, rocky, and limited on the water, yet along its banks, across its shallows, and in short downstream uses of current and craft, it already joins nearby ground into a route. People could follow it, cross it, and use it to move produce, timber, fish, travellers, and occasional goods from beyond the region. The river is still small here, but it is no longer only beside human life. It is starting to connect it, and the journey downstream can now continue along a line that communities have begun to use in common. Here along the young Danube, authority begins to take visible form in the landscape. The river is no longer only beside fields, paths, and small settlements. In the medieval period, it becomes part of a corridor that can be supervised. The low ground beside the water carries movement through the valley, and the heights above that route offer places from which access can be watched and nearby territory organised. What matters on this upper stretch is not a grand chain of fortresses, but a practical pattern: residence, administration, fortification, and control attached to points beside the river. Nuytingen provides the clearest early example. It lies in the Danube lowland on the right side of the river, where settlement, crossing, and approach all remain close to the valley floor. Merovingian grave finds their show that the place already held importance before fuller medieval records appear. By the year 881, it is recorded as the foretown of a county, and this fits the geography well. A place in the lowland, near the line of movement through the corridor, could serve not only as settlement, but as an organising point for a wider area. The river did not simply water the ground around Nuytingen, it helped make the site legible as a centre. That role becomes firmer through the royal estate connected with the place. Nuytingen was likely the administrative centre of extensive royal property in the Bar, which gives this part of the Upper Danube a distinct early medieval layer of authority. Nearby at Mariahof, excavations revealed the remains of a simple chapel and fortifications belonging to the royal court. The evidence is restrained, but that suits this river landscape. Power here did not need monumental scale to be real. A fortified court, a chapel, and an administrative seat beside the Danube corridor were enough to show that residence and protection had been fixed into the ground. Seen together, Nuytingen and Mariahof show how control worked along this young river. The aim was not theatrical defence. It was steadier than that. Authority had to be placed where routes converged, where the lowland could be monitored, and where settlement and movement could be brought under supervision. From such a position, those who held power could watch travel along the valley, manage nearby land, and anchor royal presence beside a corridor already used for communication and exchange. The river remained modest in scale, but the line it created through the Bar was worth guarding. Later, the focus of authority shifted upward to Fürstenberg. There, higher ground offered a related advantage. According to Leo B.W., the castle was probably built by the Zeringer in the second half of the 12th century, as successor to the Palatinate at Neudingen. That change matters because it shows a movement from an earlier royal centre in the lowland toward a more clearly elevated and fortified point above the surrounding route. The logic is geographical before it is dynastic. From height, control could be made more secure, more visible, and more firmly tied to a territorial seat. In the later 13th century, a small fortified town was laid out on the plateau at Fürstenberg, enclosed by a double ring of walls and 3 gates. The detail keeps the medieval picture concrete. One can picture function: walls marking a defended edge, gates regulating entry, and a settlement placed where the route below could be overlooked. Stone authority here was organised and local. It did not depend on constant warfare to matter. It depended on the need to supervise access, protect residents, and hold a position above a corridor that continued to carry people and goods along the upper Danube. A quieter later example survives near Pforen in the form of the Entenburg, a water castle near the Danube that was used by the Fürstenberg family before their shift to Donaueschingen. Even this restrained case belongs to the same pattern. Beside a still young river, guarded residence remained useful. A fortified site close to the water could serve local authority, protect a household, and maintain presence where crossing, approach, and settlement still gathered around the lowland corridor. So the banks of the young Danube now acquire another visible layer. Beside the water lie settled ground and travelled routes. Above or near them stand courts, castles, walls, and guarded residences. Neudingen in the lowland, Mariahof beside it, Fürstenberg on higher ground, and the later Entenburg near Pforen all show the same truth in different forms. This river corridor was not controlled because it was vast, but because it was useful. The land beside it could be settled, crossed, and supervised, and that made it worth holding. As the Danube continues onward, the quiet water below and the defended points above it remain part of one landscape, joined by the practical work of medieval power. Here along the young Danube, crossing becomes a practical problem that shapes daily life. The river connects settlements by giving the valley a shared line, yet it also interrupts movement between one bank and the other. East of Donaueschingen, that problem is sharpened by the ground itself. Leo B.W. describes the stretch between Donaueschingen and Pforen as an extensive marshy Danube depression. In such country, people needed dependable approaches, firmer edges, and selected places where the wet lowland could actually be crossed. The first answers were modest. Where the channel was shallower, a ford could serve in suitable conditions. Where the banks could be reached from both sides, a ferry might link one path to another. Medieval work on inland crossings identifies bridges, fords, and ferries as the main forms, and that plain sequence fits this upper Danube well. A ferry station here would not have required much built structure. Small landing places on both banks, a worn track descending toward the water, and a stretch of bank firm enough for loading and unloading could be enough. The crossing grew from repeated need. That need would have been easy to recognize on the ground. A path coming from a village could not simply run into marsh and stop. It had to find usable earth near the bank, a point where carts, animals and people on foot could approach without sinking into wet ground. On the far side, the same problem returned. A crossing was only as useful as its approaches, so the young Danube was crossed selectively, at points where the river, the lowland, and local travel routes briefly came into agreement. One can picture muddy edges strengthened by repeated passage, short bank tracks worn by hooves and wheels, and simple boats pulled into shallow water where the bank allowed. Only after such repeated local solutions does a more durable crossing begin to make sense. Pforen provides the clearest example on this upper stretch. For a long time, the Danube Bridge there was the first bridge spanning the river downstream of its formation. A regional historical account notes that this remained true until the road bridge near the Brigach and Breg confluence was built in the year 1976. Before that, Pforen held a singular role along the still young river. Older evidence adds a little more shape without turning the bridge into a monument. A map from before the 30 Years' War shows an earlier covered bridge at Forin. Later predecessors go back at least to a rebuilding in the year 1779. That is enough to show continuity and repair. Timber is the natural early material here, and timber also explains why crossings had to be maintained, rebuilt, or replaced. Wood answered the immediate need because it was workable and local, and because the river was narrow enough in selected places to justify a fixed structure. The placing of such a bridge followed practical logic rather than ambition. A bridge belonged where village routes already met the river, where the bank could be approached on firmer ground, and where the width and edges of the channel could be managed. In a broad, marshy depression, that combination would not have appeared everywhere. The river had to narrow enough, the banks had to hold, and the land on either side had to receive the traffic once it crossed. When those conditions met, a crossing point could gather importance quickly, because it saved time, reduced uncertainty, and made movement less dependent on season, water level, or the availability of a boat. That change was felt first in ordinary life. A more dependable crossing made contact between both banks less fragile. Nearby villages could meet more easily across the valley. Goods moved with less interruption. Travellers, animals, and carts no longer depended only on suitable shallows or a waiting ferry. Even then, the river was never fully predictable. Wet ground, flooding, damage to timber, and the wear of repeated use kept every crossing vulnerable. But once a bridge existed, the rhythm of movement changed. Certain approaches became habitual, certain roads more useful, and certain settlements more central because the river could be crossed there with greater regularity. So, along this young Danube, crossings begin not as grand works, but as careful adaptations to marsh, bank, and current. First come shallows, ferries, and simple landing places. Then, where repeated need justifies the effort, timber structures bind one bank to the other more securely. Forin stands out because it held that role for so long, a fixed answer in a landscape that did not allow fixed answers everywhere. The river still resists easy movement, and the lowland still demands caution, but selected crossing points now give this upper corridor a new steadiness. The Danube remains a young river, shaping what can be built and where, even as people learn to pass over it with more confidence. Here the young Danube begins to look more managed. The change is not sudden, and it does not turn this upper stretch into a large canal and lock river. What alters first is the degree of control. Earlier communities adjusted their work to the river's moods, banks, and lowland edges. By the 19th century and after, they increasingly altered the flow itself. Channels were guided, water was divided, banks were corrected, and selected reaches were brought under more regular direction. The river remains recognizably the Danube, but it now passes through a landscape where use and supervision have become more deliberate. In Donaueschingen, that shift can be seen close to the meeting of the Brigach and Breg. A local plan around the former Grasselli mill shows the two rivers not yet corrected into their later forms, yet already includes a straight timber floating canal. Even before broader river regulation took hold, water here was being led where people needed it to go. By the year 1815, the mill canal had been extended southward to improve water outflow and increase the mill's efficiency. A side channel had been cut with purpose, and the current through the works made more dependable. The mill itself made that change visible in daily operation. It had two water wheels driving several milling functions, which meant that flow was no longer only something observed or crossed. It had become a controlled source of work. Around such a place, the river landscape would have acquired a different appearance. Guided inlets, narrow channels with firmer edges, sluice points, wheel housings, and mill buildings close to the waterline. The Danube in its source region was still far from a major navigation river, but it was already being divided and reused with technical intent. A second example shows the same relationship becoming even clearer. Around the year 1820, the Badhouse complex used a breg weir, an inlet canal, a basin, and a water wheel with pumps to provide pressurized water. This was no longer only the capture of motion for grinding. It was an arrangement designed to lift and distribute water under pressure. The components themselves make the transformation easy to picture. A weir raising the level, an intake drawing water aside, a basin collecting it under control, and a wheel converting flow into force for pumping. By about the year 1870, that water wheel installation was removed and replaced by a steam-driven pump house, later associated with an electrical works. This marks another step in the same managed landscape. The channel and intake still mattered, but the source of power was no longer entirely the moving water itself. Technical structures near the river became more varied and more independent. Looking across this stretch at different moments in time, one would not see a single industrial transformation all at once. Instead, there would be an accumulation of features: guided channels, weirs, mill races, pump buildings, strengthened banks, and a waterside environment that felt increasingly planned. The wider upper Danube in Baden-Württemberg underwent related changes during the 19th century. Channel straightening, cut-offs, flood-controlled dikes, and bank stabilization reduced earlier irregularity and made the river corridor more predictable in selected ways. This was not done to create a major shipping landscape in the source region. International navigation on the Danube begins farther downstream at Kelheim, and that matters for keeping this upper stretch honest. The stronger reality here is smaller and steadier. The river was corrected, restrained, and made more useful for local power, drainage, flood control, and orderly passage through inhabited ground. Later, modern regulation carried that pattern further. Official Danube Basin material states that almost the entire regional stretch is impounded by small hydrodams, and another document of the International Commission for the Protection of the Danube River lists a series of 27 weirs between Donaueschingen and Ulm. Those numbers are best understood not as spectacle, but as repetition. The upper river becomes segmented by many modest structures. Water that once ran with greater local irregularity is now held back, released, and stepped through the landscape in shorter managed reaches. So the relationship between people and this young Danube changes in degree as well as kind. The river is still present as flowing water between settlements, meadows, and banks, but it is increasingly directed through channels, over weirs, past mill buildings, and between straighter edges than before. The current still moves onward, but more often it does so through lines, basins, embankments, and impounded stretches that show how thoroughly this upper Danube has come under human guidance. At a certain point along the Danube, settlement becomes city because the river gathers roots tightly enough to support urban form. What had earlier been a line of villages, crossings, and local control now begins to produce places of greater scale. The clearest way to see those places is from the water inward. A bank edge, a junction, a bridge, or a navigable arm gives the first clue. Then the older core, the walls, the streets, and the built edge of the city show how fully that clue was fixed into stone. Ulm offers the first clear example in this upper part of the river journey. It stands on the left bank of the Danube at the junction with the Iller and the Blau, while the river separates it from New Ulm on the opposite side. This is a position that explains itself well. A major river is joined by other waters, movement converges, and a banked edge provides firm ground for an urban core. The old city did not merely stand near the Danube. Its form once met the river directly, and the river wall still makes that relationship visible. The wall marks an older edge, where the city faced the water as a boundary, a route, and a working frontage. Seen in this way, Ulm is not simply a large settlement that happened to rise beside the Danube. Its position made enlargement possible. The river offered a line of transport and separation, while the meeting with the Iller and Blau tied the city into a broader web of inland movement. The old riverside edge helps keep that structure legible. Where the wall runs along the water, one can still read the contact between defended urban ground and the river below. The city grew inward from that edge, but the edge remained one reason it could grow. Regensburg deepens the pattern by showing a Danube city whose form is inseparable from crossing. Here, the old town and Stadthof are linked by the stone bridge, and that bridge defines the city as much as any wall or street line. Built in the 12th century, it was for almost 800 years the only reliable Danube crossing in the area. That single fact gives the urban layout its clarity. Movement did not spread evenly along the banks. It concentrated here, where the crossing held. The river organized the city by forcing approach, passage, and exchange toward one durable point. From the bridge, the surrounding urban fabric becomes easier to understand. The old town, with its narrow lanes, tall houses, and fortified medieval structure, does not read as an isolated historic core. It reads as a settlement shaped by the demands and opportunities of the Danube crossing. On the opposite side, Stadthof belongs to the same arrangement. The two sides face one another across the river, joined by masonry and daily use. The bridge does more than connect them. It creates a fixed relation between them, and over time, that relation helps stabilize a city of trade, storage, movement, and guarded access. Vienna widens the scale again, but its relation to the Danube is more complex. The medieval city was tied not to one permanent main channel in the way one might expect, but to a shifting river system with large arms and changing lines. The main arm later moved farther away, yet the city long remained closely linked to the navigable branch, later known as the Donau Canal. That waterline served transport and continued to help define the city's form well into the 19th century. In Vienna, the Danube is read less as one bank edge and more as a system whose changing arms directed urban growth. This makes Vienna especially useful for understanding how a river can shape a city, even when the water does not remain fixed in one simple position. The old city stood on ground influenced by former large river arms. Quays, approaches, and waterside working edges gathered where the usable channel held close enough to matter. Later regulation made the system more controlled, but the older spatial logic remained visible. The Donau Canal kept serving as a transport line and as a boundary that described the city's edge. Here again, the river is one of the lines from which the urban form can be read. Taken together, Ulm, Regensburg, and Vienna show the Danube creating urban scale in different but related ways. At Ulm, the junction of waters and the river wall reveal a city formed at a strong banked edge. At Regensburg, the stone bridge fixes movement into one enduring crossing and ties both sides into a single medieval structure. At Vienna, shifting arms and the lasting importance of the Donau Canal show a larger city shaped by a more complicated river setting. In each case, the water determines where bridges gather, where older cores face outward, where walls or quays are placed, and how districts on both banks come into relation. Even as the city grows larger, the Danube remains the organizing line, and the journey can continue farther into urban ground. By this stage of the journey, the Danube is no longer only a line of travel or a dividing edge between one bank and another. It is also a place people come back to in recurring ways. Along so large a river, there is no single custom shared from the Black Forest to the Delta. What returns instead are local habits of gathering at the water, a civic procession in one town, a blessing at the winter river in another, working routines beside channels and reeds farther downstream, and a modern day of observance spread across many countries. The forms differ, but the movement is similar. People go back to the same banks because the river remains part of how communal life is marked. At Ulm, this repeated return takes a public and distinctly urban form. Each year, Schwörmontag brings the old civic calendar back to the Danube, and with it comes the Nabada, the river procession whose name is commonly understood as bathing down the Danube. Boats, improvised craft, and people on the water turn the river into a shared civic space. But the deeper point is steadier than display. The Danube is not used here as a backdrop. It is the place to which the city returns in order to repeat an older public rhythm. Streets may carry the crowd toward the embankment, but the observance is completed only when bodies, boats, and current meet again in the same stretch of water below the city. Farther downstream in Budapest, the return to the river can take the form of blessing. At Epiphany, a procession goes to the Danube, and a cross is immersed in the water. In a large capital city, the rite still keeps a direct, physical simplicity. Clergy, attendants, winter air, the open river, and the moment when the cross touches the current are enough. The ceremony is often understood as an urban extension of older Hungarian village customs of blessing water at this season. That link matters because it keeps the act close to use rather than spectacle. The river is approached as water that must be acknowledged, blessed, and entered into the cycle of the year. Even in a city of quays, bridges, and traffic, the observance depends on standing at the bank and turning back toward the flow itself. In the Danube Delta, continuity appears in quieter and more practical ways. UNESCO describes traditional occupations here in terms that are plain and exact, with fishing identified as the predominant and oldest occupation, alongside reed harvesting and other work shaped by wetland conditions. This allows a different kind of inherited custom to come into view. There may be no procession, no formal rite, and no fixed civic speech, yet repetition is just as strong. Boats are prepared near narrow channels. Nets are handled where water depth and current are known from long use. People watch levels, weather, and access through reeds, then return again when season and conditions allow. Work of this kind does not need ornament to show continuity. Its tradition lies in doing the same necessary things beside the same water, with knowledge passed in practice from one generation to the next, often in small settlements where the channels still set the pace of daily movement. A broader and more recent form of return appears on the 29th of June, when Danube Day is observed across the basin. This is not an old local custom in the same sense as a city procession or a village-derived water blessing, yet it still shows how widely the river remains a shared reference. The observance explicitly honours the Danube as a source of water, food, power, recreation, and livelihood. What matters here is not ceremony for its own sake, but the fact that communities in many different places still set aside time to face the river directly and name what it provides. The basin is culturally varied, linguistically varied, and historically uneven, but a common date can still draw attention back to the same running system that supports daily life in many forms. Taken together, these returns stay modest and concrete. In Ulm, people go back to the water as part of civic routine. In Budapest, the river is blessed in a rite that binds urban ceremony to older seasonal practice. In the Delta, fishing and reed work preserve continuity through repeated labour rather than formal observance. Across the basin, Danube Day offers a newer annual return shaped by shared dependence. None of this forms one uniform river culture, and that is precisely the point. The Danube becomes culturally central through repetition at many separate banks. The names, prayers, tools, and public meanings change from place to place, but the act remains recognizable. People come back to the water, and in doing so, they keep the river inside communal life as the journey moves on, ready to take on another form farther downstream. Many people moved along the Danube, crossed it, traded on it, measured it, or tried to command a difficult stretch of its current. Only a few left, especially clear traces in the way the river was recorded, improved, or made safer for passage. Their importance lies less in personality than in result. One made the Danube easier to read on paper. Another pushed obstructed reaches toward more regular navigation. A third helped impose a clearer route near the sea. What remains is not legend, but durable marks. Books, surveys, cuttings, training works, and channels whose use continued after the people themselves were gone. Luigi Ferdinando Marsigli enters this larger river first through observation. In the late 17th century, he worked along the Danube in a manner that later river heritage work still describes as unusually systematic. His study, Danubius Pannonico Mysicus, brought together the river's natural history in 6 volumes. But the value of the work is not simply that it was large, it made the Danube more legible. Banks, currents, surrounding ground, plants, fish, antiquities, and local conditions were drawn into one sustained attempt to record the river across political frontiers. Instead of treating the Danube as a vague boundary or a route known only in fragments, Marsigli helped fix it in maps, notes, and ordered description. He did not alter the current with stone or timber. He altered how the river could be known, studied, and compared from one reach to another. Farther downstream, the matter shifts from knowledge to movement. By the early 19th century, some of the Danube's most difficult stretches placed real limits on navigation, especially in the gorge region later known collectively as the Iron Gates. When Istvan Szechenyi was appointed Royal Commissioner for the development of Danube navigation in the year 1833, he committed himself to the practical problem of making this obstructed passage more usable. His place on the river is not chiefly ceremonial or political here. It lies in the effort to regularize a dangerous stretch where rock, current, and narrow passage could resist reliable traffic. Improvement meant close attention to the actual form of the river, where the flow pressed hardest, where reefs and shoals hindered movement, and where works might reduce uncertainty for vessels trying to pass. Beside Szechenyi stands Pal Vasarely, briefly but necessarily. If Szechenyi gave energy and direction to the project, Vasarely supplied the hydrographic and engineering precision that turned intention into measured river work. Soundings, calculations, surveys, and plans belong to his side of the story. His presence keeps the Danube grounded as a physical problem, rather than a stage for reforming language. In the gorge, the river had to be read not only politically or economically, but in terms of depth, slope, rock, and confined force. Even where later developments would continue the work in new ways, the partnership left a clear functional trace. The difficult passage was no longer approached as an unchangeable obstacle, but as a reach that could be studied, cut, cleared, and managed with greater precision. At the lower end of the river, where the Danube breaks into branches before meeting the Black Sea, Charles Augustus Hartley appears in an even more visibly engineered landscape. Working as engineer-in-chief for the European Commission of the Danube, he was part of an international attempt to make the maritime Danube more dependable for navigation. Here, the practical focus narrows toward the Sulina branch. Bars, shifting sediment, unstable mouths, and uncertain depth had long complicated entry and exit. Hartley's importance lies in helping turn that unstable approach into a more controlled corridor. Piers, dredging, channel guidance, and hydraulic discipline belong to this reach of the story. Near the sea, where current, silt, and wind could quickly undo easy assumptions, the work required sustained intervention rather than a single gesture. The result was safer and more regular passage through a difficult river mouth. These traces differ in form, but they belong to the same practical history. Marsigli left volumes, surveys, and a more exact record of the river as an object of study. Szechenyi, with Vasarely beside him, helped shift an obstructed gorge toward more deliberate navigation works. Hartley left physical interventions at the maritime end, where training works and channel control remained visible in the handling of ships and water. The river was older than their plans, broader than their careers, and never fully settled by any one scheme. Yet for a time, each helped make one part of it more readable, more passable, or more controlled. As the journey continues, those human traces remain in view, set against a river that always exceeds the hands that try to shape it. Here, the Danube must be seen not as a single ribbon of water, but as a living corridor made of many connected places. Its ecological richness depends on difference. In some upper reaches, the current runs faster past gravel islands and steeper banks, with bare stone at the waterline and shallower margins where the flow breaks around exposed bars. In the middle river, side arms, floodplain woods, wet meadows, and quieter backwaters widen the margin between land and channel. Farther down, wetlands open into lakes, reed beds, marshes, and branching channels. These places matter most where the river is still allowed to remain fully or partly connected to them, so that flow, seasonal flooding, shifting sediment, and changing water levels continue to create new edges, shallows, cover, and resting ground. Protected stretches help make that pattern visible. They are important not simply because a boundary has been drawn around them, but because they preserve areas where the Danube still behaves like a river, with room to spread, slow, divide, and return. When floodwater can still enter side channels or reach low woodland, the landscape does not settle into one fixed form. A quiet inlet in one season may be rejoined more strongly in the next, and a low bank may be dry for weeks before being covered again. Gravel bars are built and reduced again. Mud is laid down on flat banks. Backwaters warm and quieten in ways the main channel does not. Oxbows and silted inlets hold water after the stronger current has passed. The result is a chain of habitats linked by the river's own movement rather than a narrow strip of scenery beside human works. The Donau-Auen National Park offers one of the clearest examples of this variety gathered into a single river landscape. Within one protected stretch, the Danube runs beside side arms, gravel banks, flat silty margins, steeper banks, riparian forest, and open meadows. The eye can follow how the ground changes with moisture and flooding. Willow and poplar take hold along wetter edges where the river reaches often or leaves fresh deposits behind. Reeds rise where water lingers and the flow weakens. Wet meadows mark places that are not permanently submerged, yet still shaped by damp soil and flood rhythm. In this kind of floodplain, vegetation is not decoration. It shows how depth, silt, shade, and duration of standing water divide the river margin into distinct living spaces. Once those spaces are visible, the birds and fish that belong to them begin to make quiet sense. Along shallows, muddy edges, and slow sidewaters, grey herons wait where fish can be taken in calm water. Kingfishers use banks and waterside cover near clear shallows, depending on edges where perch, open water, and shelter stand close together. In freer flowing Danube water, fish such as barbel belong to the stronger current and better oxygenated channel. In calmer backwaters and sidewaters, carp and other species find different conditions. Softer bottom, warmer water, more shelter, and refuge when the main flow is too forceful. These are not separate worlds. They remain connected by flood, channel exchange, and seasonal change, which allow feeding, spawning, shelter, and movement to depend on one another. Farther downstream, the same ecological logic broadens rather than changes. In the Danube Delta, channels, lakes, marshes, and vast reed beds create one of the largest wetland systems in Europe. Water spreads, slows, branches, and gathers again across a low landscape where open water and dense vegetation stand close together. This is why the delta can hold such large concentrations of bird life, including pelicans and herons, and why rich fish life persists there as well, with sturgeon among the most notable river species tied to the lower Danube. The abundance is not the result of one feature alone. It comes from the meeting of shallow feeding areas, sheltered channels, reed-fringed margins, submerged roots, and seasonally changing levels that keep many kinds of habitat in contact. What links these different stretches of the Danube is not sameness, but interdependence. Current, depth, mud, gravel, shade, reeds, floodplain woods, and floodwater each do a different part of the work. One place offers spawning ground, another gives cover, another provides insects, fish, or resting space. The richest sections are often the quieter ones, where the river is still able to enter side arms, soak woodland soil, leave silt on a low bank, or hold shallow water behind reeds. In those places, life remains tied to river process rather than fixed scenery. The journey can move on from here, but this living pattern stays beside the water, changing gently wherever the Danube still has room to shape the ground for itself. Near Tulcea, about 80 kilometers from the Black Sea, the Danube begins to lose the look of a single bounded river. The water is still moving toward the sea, but its final phase is no longer one channel held between two steady banks. The land grows flatter, the margins soften, and the river starts to open into the Danube delta. This is the point where the journey becomes wider rather than sharper. Instead of ending at one neat mouth, the Danube separates and spreads into a low landscape of channels, marshes, reedland, lakes, and newly formed ground, all still shaped by the river's movement. The structure of that final landscape rests on three main distributaries. The Chilia branch carries water along the northern side. The Sulina branch runs more directly seaward and is the main navigable channel. The Sfântu Gheorghe branch bends southward through another broad part of the delta. These three arms give the delta its frame, but they do not reduce it to three simple lines. Between and around them lies a much more intricate pattern of secondary channels, shallow bays, floodplain water, muddy margins, and long reaches of reeds where land and water are not cleanly separated. What appears on a map as branching can, at ground level, feel more like a maze of low banks, quiet water, wet soil, and narrow passages opening unexpectedly into broader sheets of water. This is why the delta does not behave like a final point. It behaves like a zone. Water divides, rejoins, slows, and passes through a broad plain where slight changes in level matter. One bank may be firm enough for willow and low growth, while a nearby margin gives way into mud, standing water, or reeds rooted in shallow, flooded ground. Lakes lie behind channels. Islands sit low in the water. Floodplains widen between the main arms. In some stretches the horizon opens, but it does so over a surface still full of detail. Reed beds shifting in the wind, flat silty edges, narrow cuts of moving water, and shallows where sediment has gathered. The Danube remains active here, but its action is dispersed across many small forms rather than concentrated in one confined course. A traveller moving through the delta does not meet one final bank and one final mouth. Instead, there are repeated transitions. From channel to lake, from lake to reed, fringed passage, from firm ground to soaked margin, and from open water to low land barely raised above it. Sediment is the steady process that makes this last transformation possible. For a long distance upstream, the Danube has carried silt and sand in suspension and along its bed. In the delta's low gradient terrain, with weaker slope and a more distributed flow, much of that load begins to settle. The result is visible in bars, shallow banks, muddy shelves, and new edges of land forming at the mouths of branches and along quieter waters. Deposition does not create one finished shape and leave it in place. It keeps adjusting the delta. A channel margin extends a little. A low island becomes more defined. A shallow area holds back more reeds. Sediment gathers where current loses force. And over time, that accumulation helps the delta continue its outward growth toward the sea. The final shoreline is therefore not rigid. It is a working edge, built gradually by material the river has carried from far inland and laid down here where the current can no longer hold all of it in motion. Even the Sulina branch, though important for navigation, makes most sense when seen inside this larger land-building system. It is a route through the delta, but the delta itself is the larger fact. Around the navigable water lie long reed-filled reaches, lakes connected by lesser channels, and areas where wet ground is only slightly raised above the surrounding water. The eye is drawn less to height than to spread. There are no valley sides here, no enclosing slopes, and few hard boundaries. Water occupies not only channels, but also hollows, marshes, lake surfaces, and reed-fringed flats. The Danube has not ceased to be a river, yet it now reaches the sea in a form that is part channel, part wetland, and part freshly built land. Even where one distributary seems clear and direct, the broader delta keeps reminding the viewer that this ending is multiple, low, and still in motion. As the Black Sea comes nearer, the horizon grows broader and the edges grow softer. The river no longer presents one final line to follow. It arrives as a spread of flowing water, wet ground, and sediment-built margins that remain inseparable from one another. The mouths of the branches face the open sea, but the last impression is still of a river at work, dividing, depositing, extending, and quietly altering its own boundary with the coast. Here, at its widest and lowest ending, the Danube does not stop so much as loosen into water and land together, leaving the journey ready to continue outward into the open shore beyond. Seen beside a few other major rivers, the Danube comes into clearer proportion. At about 2,850 kilometers in length, it is plainly a long river, the second longest in Europe after the Volga, and much longer than the Rhine. Yet, scale alone does not explain its character. The Danube is better understood as a long European river whose significance grows from dense settlement, repeated navigation, and the unusual fact that so many different states, capitals, and borderlands stand along one connected course. It is large, but not giant in the hydraulic sense suggested by the Mississippi. Its identity comes as much from shared use and political geography as from length. The Volga provides the first useful contrast because it shows what greater scale within Europe looks like. It is longer than the Danube, and its regime has been much more deeply altered by reservoirs, hydropower, irrigation, and inland water management. It is also more strongly fed by snow and ends in the enclosed basin of the Caspian Sea. Set beside that river, the Danube appears less like an inland system built chiefly around one state, and more like a sea-directed river shared among many. Its waters move toward the Black Sea, and its course remains outward-facing in a way the Volga's does not. The comparison helps fix the Danube not as Europe's largest river, but as one of its most internationally distributed and externally connected ones. The Rhine clarifies something different. It is much shorter, at about 1,230 kilometers, yet it has become one of the world's most heavily used inland transport routes. Along its corridor, navigation, ports, industry, and canal links are concentrated with unusual intensity. The Danube shares part of that navigable role, especially since the main Danube Canal was completed in the year 1992, allowing traffic to move between the North Sea and the Black Sea. Even so, the Danube feels less narrowly concentrated than the Rhine. Its working life is spread across more states, broader rural intervals, older imperial frontiers, and several historic capitals, rather than being gathered so tightly into one western industrial belt. The Mississippi then widens the perspective beyond Europe. In basin size, discharge, and continental reach, it belongs to a larger hydraulic order than the Danube. Its watershed drains about 40% of the continental United States, and the scale of water and sediment moving through that system is far greater. That difference matters because it prevents the Danube from being mistaken for a giant river merely because it is long. The Danube is continental in reach, but not continental in the same overpowering physical sense. The Mississippi also flows within one national political framework for most of its course, while the Danube remains divided among many jurisdictions, languages, and historical regions, even when its waterway function is continuous. The contrast with the Mississippi also sharpens the meaning of the Danube's delta. Both rivers build outward where they lose force and begin to lay down sediment, but the Mississippi does so with a much larger basin and a much heavier volume of water moving toward the Gulf. The Danube Delta is broad, active, and visibly land-building, yet it belongs to a different scale of river process. This makes the Danube easier to place. Long enough to link very different regions, strong enough to support major navigation and delta formation, but not so immense that size overwhelms every other feature. Human density, international passage, and historical layering remain closer to the center of its identity. Set beside the Volga, the Rhine, and the Mississippi, the Danube becomes more distinct rather than less. It is not the largest of these rivers, not the most industrially concentrated, and not the most voluminous. What stands out instead is the combination of length, urban continuity, political division, and varied physical character. Few rivers pass so steadily from upland source country to imperial cities, agricultural plains, gorge, wetland, and sea-built delta, while remaining a shared route across so many borders. That is the proportion that suits the Danube best. A long, multi-state river whose place in the world depends not only on size, but on the unusual density of human and historical life, arranged along one connected flow. For a long time, the Danube was fixed on paper before it could be fixed with precision. That is what makes old maps along this river so quietly revealing. They do not simply show where the water went, and they are not interesting only because they were later surpassed. They show what people most needed to see there: a fortress above a bank, a town at a crossing, an island in a disputed reach, a frontier line running near a shifting channel. On such pages, the Danube appears not as one perfectly measured form, but as a selected river, arranged according to danger, movement, and control. In the 17th and early 18th centuries, this selectiveness is easy to notice. Beauplan's work gave strong attention to borderlands and strategic ground. Kreckwitz and Petrus Schenk, in different ways, also treated the river as a corridor of places that mattered unevenly. Fortified towns stand firm. Islands are marked because they affect passage or defence. Certain bends and reaches receive care because soldiers, merchants, and officials needed them. Other stretches are simplified, widened, or smoothed. The result is not careless drawing. It is a practical way of looking, shaped by war, travel, and political geography along a long and difficult river, where what stood on the bank could matter more than the exact curve of the water. A different habit of looking appears with Luigi Ferdinando Marsigli. His Danube work still belongs to a world of empire and frontier, yet it moves closer to systematic observation. The river is no longer only a chain of notable points. It becomes something to be surveyed, sketched, measured, and compared from reach to reach. Banks, side channels, depths, and current begin to matter as parts of one connected physical system. Notes and drawings work together. The Danube becomes more legible, not because it has stopped changing, but because human attention has become steadier, more patient, and more interested in the behavior of the water itself, from the line of a bank to the force of a flowing reach. Even then, a map could never be only a neutral record. Around Bratislava, historical mapping preserves a Danube that was still restless before large-scale channelization. There the river shifted across its floodplain in multiple threads. Channels cut away and rejoined. Gravel bars rose in one place and vanished in another. Secondary branches were abandoned and then replaced by new ones. Low islands formed out of sediment and brush, while older channels remained as pale traces across the flat ground. On paper, these changes can look like corrections made by better surveyors, but they also record a real river in motion. The shape altered because the Danube altered. The map changed because the ground and water had changed first. By the 19th century, official mapping brought a new level of exactness, and the Passetti map stands out clearly in that long effort. It followed the Danube from the German-Austrian border to the Iron Gate with unusual precision. Banks are traced carefully. Currents are noted. Water depths, shoals, and traffic routes are included with a degree of hydrographic detail that earlier mapmakers rarely attempted. Here the river can be read almost as working infrastructure. The page serves pilots, engineers, and administrators as much as curious viewers. Yet this greater clarity also reveals a harder purpose. A river, measured in such detail, is easier to regulate, to improve for navigation, and to bring under firmer state direction. That purpose becomes especially clear near Vienna. The Passetti map preserves the Danube before the great works that began in 1870, when the river near the city was increasingly forced into a more regular form. Earlier reaches had spread, divided, and reformed across a broader space of side arms, wooded islands, gravel margins, and low flood ground. Seasonal water could open one path and leave another shallow. Later regulation narrowed choices that the water had once kept open. Embankments, cut banks, and controlled channels would increasingly replace a looser river pattern. So the map is valuable not only because it is accurate, it is valuable because it catches a moment just before a major rearrangement of the riverbank and channel. Looked at slowly, these maps do more than improve from age to age. Each one fixes the Danube only for a moment and only according to a particular need. One page watches a frontier. Another gathers observations. Another prepares the river for traffic and control. Beneath all of them, the same difficulty remains. The Danube keeps shifting, whether through flood, sediment, side channels, or human intervention. Paper can hold a version of the river, but never the final one. And once the line has been drawn, the water is already moving on, leaving room for the next way of seeing it. A river enters language almost as naturally as it enters a valley. The Danube, in particular, has long invited description because its physical form already contains movement, distance, crossing, separation, and return. A bank can divide one world from another. A bridge can fail. A ferry can carry travellers toward an uncertain shore. A current can mark direction even before a road or border is named. That is why the Danube continues not only through land and history, but also through written words. Again and again, it appears in epic, poetry, and prose not as decoration, but as a real line of passage that writers could use, because the river itself already offered that shape. One of the clearest older examples lies in the Nibelungenlied, which belongs to the Danube region and gives the river a firm narrative role. Here the water is not a painted medieval backdrop placed behind the action. It is a threshold that must actually be crossed, and that crossing carries weight. Bridges and river passage matter in practical terms. The Danube interrupts movement, channels it, and exposes travellers to delay and warning. It is also the setting for one of the poem's most striking moments, when prophetic water beings appear and attach foreknowledge to a real stretch of river travel. The effect is strongest because the river remains concrete. There is water to cross, a journey to continue, and danger attached to a place where passage narrows into decision. The Danube becomes an obstacle, a route, and an omen-bearing boundary at the same time. Poetry approaches the river differently, but not more vaguely. In Hölderlin's hymn, Der Ister, using an ancient name for the Danube, the river becomes a way of thinking about origin, movement, and return without losing its physical presence as flowing water. That is one reason rivers recur so often in verse. They do not need to be forced into meaning. They already offer a visible model for it. Water moves forward while remaining part of the same course. It links distant ground. It can seem to come from a beginning that stays partly out of sight, while also drawing the eye towards somewhere beyond the present bend. In Hölderlin's handling, the Danube is not merely a symbol floating free of the land. It is a concrete image through which poetry can approach questions of time, home, departure, and the strange relation between source and return. Longer narrative prose often uses the Danube in another way, as a travel line that can hold together many scenes without breaking. Jules Verne's Le Beau Danube Jaune, also known as the Danube Pilot, follows that possibility closely. The river gives the story a ready-made direction. It allows movement from one reach to the next, from upper stretches toward lower ones, through changing languages, customs, and riverbank settings. Towns, boats, fisheries, watchpoints, and open reaches can all enter by way of the same channel. The Danube is useful to prose here because it provides continuity without sameness. The course keeps going, but the banks keep changing. A writer can move onward with the current, while still allowing each stretch to feel distinct. In Claudio Magris's Danube, that continuity becomes more reflective, though still anchored to the river's actual course. The book uses the journey from source towards sea as a line through cities, borderlands, memories, books, and the overlapping cultures of Central Europe. Yet even at its most thoughtful, the river remains the organizing fact. It is the thing that lets very different materials stay connected. Quays, streets, former imperial centres, provincial edges, and multilingual regions can all be approached because the Danube passes through them in sequence. Magris does not treat the river as an excuse for abstraction. He treats it as a physical thread that makes historical variety legible. The prose can widen outward, but it does so from the bank, from the current, from the continuous fact of a waterway running through divided and shared worlds alike. Taken together, these writings show a pattern that stays close to the river's form. In epic, the Danube can become a crossing place, a warning line, or a point where a journey changes character. In poetry, it can offer a clear image for origin, passage, distance, and return. In prose, it can hold together long movement through different regions, languages, and historical layers without losing direction. None of this requires the river to mean everything. The Danube keeps reappearing in words for a simpler reason. Its actual course already contains the structures that language often needs. A route to follow, a border to cross, a margin between one shore and another, and a continuous line that still changes from reach to reach. Once that line enters writing, it remains there, ready for the journey to go on. The present Danube is, in many places, a visibly managed river. Its banks are often held in place by stone, concrete, levees, or engineered slopes. Side arms that once opened and closed with changing water are cut off or only weakly linked. Floodplain ground that was once regularly soaked now lies behind embankments, reached by the river less often or not at all. Along this corridor, cities, farmland, ports, hydropower works, navigation channels, and flood defence have all left their mark. Across the wider Danube basin, more than 4/5 of the river is regulated for flood protection. About 30% of its length is also impounded for hydropower, and the main tributaries carry more than 700 dams and weirs. Seen from the bank, those large figures become physical changes. Straighter edges, quieter sidewaters, interrupted flow, and less room for the river to spread. These changes matter because they alter how the Danube works as a living system. Where barriers interrupt the current, fish movement is broken. Sediment that once travelled onward may settle too early, while other reaches below are left starved of material. Where floodplains are disconnected, shallow backwaters, wet meadows, marshy margins, and seasonal pools become rarer or less active. That means fewer sheltered places for spawning, feeding, and recovery when the main channel runs fast or cold. Hardened banks simplify the river edge itself. Instead of roots, reeds, gravel tongues, and eroding soil, there may be a fixed line with less shelter and less variation. The result is not only a narrower shape on a map, but a reduction in small habitats that once made the Danube more diverse from one bank to the other. Water quality adds another layer of pressure, though here the picture is mixed rather than uniformly dark. Nutrients, hazardous substances, and plastics all remain part of the present river. Basin-wide monitoring found microplastics in nearly all samples during the 4th Joint Danube Survey, a sign that even a moving river now carries fine traces of modern consumption. yet other pressures have eased compared with earlier decades. Nutrient emissions have fallen markedly over the past 15 years, and recent loads are now close to agreed targets for the Black Sea. So the modern Danube cannot be described honestly as either healed or steadily worsening in every respect. Some burdens have been reduced. Others remain persistent, diffuse, and difficult to remove from such a heavily used basin. The ecological consequences are most visible where several pressures meet. A river that is impounded, narrowed, separated from its floodplain, and burdened by polluted runoff becomes less varied in rhythm and shelter. Long-distance migrants such as sturgeon are especially vulnerable to broken continuity. A species that once depended on open movement along a long river corridor now meets dams, altered flow, and degraded spawning access. But smaller and less famous species are affected as well, because the loss of side channels, wetlands, and soft banks removes the ordinary kinds of refuge that many forms of river life depend on. The Danube still flows on a large scale, but in many reaches it does so with less freedom to divide, reconnect, overflow, and renew its margins. Even so, some stretches are being opened again, cautiously and in part. Across the basin, hundreds of measures to improve fish migration are planned, and tens of thousands of hectares of wetlands and floodplains are intended for reconnection by 2027. These are practical attempts to return some movement where total restoration is no longer possible. In Austria, the Traisen restoration created a new meandering riverbed linked again to floodplain wetlands and fish passage. Instead of a fixed and simplified channel, the water was given more space to bend, sort sediment, and form shallower edges. Elsewhere, the Life Plus Network Danube project added bypass channels and fish routes at selected barriers, allowing movement around structures that had once blocked it almost completely. None of these efforts return the Danube to an untouched past, because that past no longer exists along most of the river. Ports remain active, levees remain necessary in many settled reaches, and navigation and power generation continue to shape the water. But partial restoration can still matter. A reconnected sidearm can hold slower water, reeds, young fish, and birds along a wet margin. A bypass channel can turn a wall across the current into something more passable. A newly meandering reach can restore variation that a straightened bed had removed. The present Danube, therefore, holds two conditions at once. Much of it remains fixed, simplified, and under pressure. Yet, in some places, space, continuity, and wet ground are being given back, and the river begins, carefully, to loosen again. The Danube returns most clearly when it is seen again at its small beginning. In the Black Forest, near Donaueschingen, there is no grand opening equal to the scale of the river that will follow. There is a joining instead, where the Brigach and the Breg come together, and a single recognizable course begins. From that modest formation, the water takes on direction. It leaves the wooded upper ground, gathers itself between sloping banks, and moves into a world where stone, soil, weather, and human use begin to shape it at every reach. What later becomes broad and divided first appears as a narrower current, still close to its making. From there, the river can be felt less as a sequence of separate places than as one long corridor changing its form while remaining continuous. In the upper stretches, the current still bears the mark of gradient and confined ground. Farther on, the banks open into settled land where villages, fields, and early crossings come close to the water. Roads approach it, bridges test it, defended heights watch over it. Quays, walls, and embankments appear where the Danube meets larger towns and later cities. The river passes worked land and built edges, but it never becomes only a line between them. It remains the thing that gives them position, pressure, and connection. That is why so many different layers could belong to the same river world without breaking it apart. Rock and gravel in the upper course, wider plains farther east, villages at fords, ferries at crossings, storehouses near the bank, church towers above the floodline, fortresses on commanding ground, and city fronts turned toward quays and bridges all stand within the same movement of water. So do the less solid things that formed along it. Routes of trade, habits of settlement, names carried from language to language, stories attached to crossings, and maps that tried, each in their own way, to hold the river still on paper. None of these were separate from the Danube. Each took shape because the river offered a path, a boundary, a resource, or a problem that had to be answered. The same continuity holds in the quieter stretches as well. Beyond the walls, ports, and engineered banks, the Danube also remained a floodplain river, with side waters, reed margins, wooded islands, marshy ground, fish routes, and bird-filled wetlands. In some reaches, the current still spread into a looser pattern of branches and backwaters. In others, it was narrowed, straightened, embanked, or interrupted by locks, weirs, and dams. Modern management pressed hard upon it. Banks were fixed. Floodplains were cut away from regular inundation. Migration routes were broken. Yet even there, the river did not become a dead line. It stayed active within limits, and in some places those limits have been eased a little, with side channels reopened, wet ground reconnected, and space cautiously returned where modern conditions still allow it. So the Danube changes again and again without losing its identity, from narrow source to wider middle water, from stony upper reaches to slower lower ground, from first crossings to major cities, from older river use to modern regulation and partial repair. It remains one continuous movement. The forms differ, the banks differ, the human claims placed upon the water differ, but the river continues through them all, carrying a recognizable line across Central and Southeastern Europe for about 2,850 kilometers until that line reaches the low country near the Black Sea and begins to loosen. There, the ending is no longer a single channel held between two banks. The Danube divides into three main branches and spreads across the Danube Delta, where the land is low, wet, and only partly firm. Reeds thicken along the margins. Channels separate and rejoin. Water lies still in some places and slides onward in others. Mud, silt, and floating vegetation collect in sheltered ground. The banks are lower now, the horizon broader, the current less confined. What began as a modest joining in the Black Forest opens here into a wide and branching landscape of shallow edges, open water, and reed-filled passages. In that final widening, the river does not end by stopping, it ends by spreading. The Danube that once gathered itself between narrower banks now enters a place where it divides, slows, and passes outward through marsh, channel, and lake toward the Black Sea. The line is no longer singular, but it is still the same river, altered once more in form, released into low ground and open horizon, and continuing there in water, reeds, and broad delta light.